Steve Rogers, throughout this movie, I would argue, doesn't truly change who he is innately. And that's the whole point. And that's the conversation he has with the doctor when he says, good becomes great. So if anything, he just becomes better. But it's like he becomes great in the sense that he is empowered.
Mm-hmm.
But the character of Captain America remains the same. And that's crucial to the story of this movie, because if he didn't have that good character, he wouldn't have been chosen for this project.
I just see, like, in his character, I see things that are compelling and are that you can relate to in a certain level because of the ideals that are present. But I don't see him as a flawed character.
But I think that Steve Rogers, while he is flawed, he is not super flawed. And so his arc is very minimal. And when you see that in the film, this causes to some of the detriments in the film overall. Now, Steve Rogers' flaw, in my opinion, is... Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot, the podcast by storytellers for storytellers so that we can tell better stories ourselves. As always, I'm your host, Maverick, and today we have back with us our two favorite co-hosts, Avalon and Andrew, to review the earliest in the Captain America series, the very original, the First Avenger. That's what we're talking about. Number 1, Captain America. If you guys watched our review last time, we realized we needed to backtrack a little bit and get back to the basics and see why that one sucked so much, starting with why this one is great. Or is it? We'll get into that today, but before we get into that, obviously, we want to talk about what this movie is written by, because we have them to thank or blame. So, it was written by Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely and directed by Joe Johnston. There you go. I actually didn't look to see if they were on the credits for the latest one. That would be worth double-checking, but we're not going to do that right now. What we're going to do is get that initial impression. Andrew, what are your thoughts and your review of Captain America, the First Avenger?
It was good.
Wow, that's amazing. You got any further thoughts? What was your rating on this guy?
Well, my thoughts is this movie is the equivalent of vanilla ice cream in terms of movies. And then my rating was a 5.95, but I rounded it up to a 6.
Wow, okay. Avalon, what were your thoughts?
This is one of those movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe I think of fondly in my memory, only because, like, I went to the theaters, like, it was like a birthday gift to go see this movie on in theaters. And also, it was one of those movies that stood out to me at the time. So, I mean, watching it again, some of it definitely still holds up. There's a few things I noticed this time to its detriment this time around, but I still gave it a 6.4. Now, that being said, it was a 6.4, but that's only because I answered your questions the way they were intended on the 9-point rating system, because I have different opinions on some of the questions and what I answered.
So you're saying, like, personally, you think it deserves a better rating than what you got out of the system?
Well, like, yeah, it would have gotten a higher rating based on certain things, but because I don't think in this particular case some of those questions mattered as much.
Interesting.
But
that is definitely worthy of a discussion. I would agree with that.
Okay.
We'll try to get into that today, but my personal rating was, I recalled watching this movie, like, as a kid as well, 2011 it comes out, and you're like, oh my goodness, this new movie about World War II, but it's a superhero movie, let's see what it's about, and it's pretty good, right? But there was a couple things that I recalled vaguely bothering me, and not really sure why. And watching it this time, I had a couple of those eureka moments where I went, oh my goodness, that's why I had a problem with this, because this, and we'll get into that today. I don't know that it's vanilla ice cream, because I still actually got the highest rating of all you guys in this review. I gave it a 7. So, right at the point where it's like, this is a solid movie. I enjoy watching it. I would gladly watch it again, but I'm not going to say this is the top-notch best thing since sliced bread, So, we'll get into that today. If you're interested, keep listening. But if you are unfamiliar with Captain America, the First Avenger, Avalon, do you want to make the audience familiar with the plot line and tell them what Captain America the First Avenger is about.
So, Captain America: The First Avenger is about Steve Rogers, a young guy from Brooklyn who's kind of a weak, small person but he doesn't like bowing down to bullies, more or less. So he gets him into trouble a lot of times. But he's also very patriotic. He because every time he tries to enlist for World War II, he keeps getting rejected. Tries to enlist through a government program, like a science program, which turns him into a super soldier. And this is how he ends up getting onto the front lines and ends up getting into conflict with the Nazis' science organization, Hydra. And the movie from there is about conflict between Captain America and Red Skull.
That's the basics of it. Obviously, you already got our reviews, so we're going to get into the actual system, breaking it down piece by piece right now. Let's start off with that opening scene. You get that scene where they get this John Carpenter-esque The Thing situation. They're going through the snow and the ice. Is it an alien? It looks like a flying saucer at first. No, it's just a massive plane, and there's a shield in the ice, right? Cue back up. We're in 1942, right? You get the Red Skull coming at it with, which you don't know he's the Red Skull yet, going to look for the Tesseract, and then you get Steve Rogers enlisting, right? This is encompassing hooking us into the film. What are you guys' thoughts on that opening scene? Let's hit it off with Andrew. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I thought it was pretty good. You haven't gotten to the point yet in the MCU where you have kind of that blueprint for how you ought to open a movie, which we've discussed with the Thor movies, where you have like the epic fight scene at the beginning and all that, which I think is also something that's unique to the first phase of Marvel, because you don't have established heroes yet. You are establishing the heroes in these movies. And I think Iron Man 2 is... I don't think Iron Man 2 does that. And I have to go rewatch it. Gosh, it's not a movie I enjoy watching, but I don't think they have the massive fight scene at the beginning of that movie either. I'm remembering a race at the beginning of that movie. That said, though, my point is we haven't gotten to that point yet, and for as far as an opener goes, like assuming this person has no idea what they're getting into, right? All they've seen is, say, a trailer of the Captain America movie. I think this opening is good enough to keep your attention, as well as kind of open up the plot and the different avenues that this story is going to take.
As far as the opener goes, it's funny that you mentioned John Carpenter's The Thing, because I had the exact same thought watching it this time around. I was like, the opening is very shrouded in mystery. Where it's like, and that's actually really good for an opening, because you kind of want that mystery where it's like, what is this? Where are we? What is happening? And then we're just shown the inside of this massive ship, whatever it is, and then we see a shield in the ice, which we know is Captain America's shield, but we don't know, like, we don't see anything else. We're not shown anything else. We're just shown that in the ice. And then we're cut back to 1942, and we're shown the Hydra invading Norway, getting into this temple or this place and getting the Tesseract, which also is a good like introduction to Schmidt and the Red Skull, because it's like we're not shown who he is either, but we're shown this Nazi guy who suddenly has more strength than like half a dozen men, and we're shown his devotion to like Norse mythology. So like we're just given a bunch of stuff within the first opening scenes of this movie that establish like the Hydra, the villain, even like, and then we cut to Steve Rogers has shown his character as well, and it's all very like engaging and establishes everything early on.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that it's definitely good at even from the start. You see them sitting in the tension as they slowly reveal things like, oh my goodness, they're in the snow and stuff like that. So it's pretty good. John Carpenter. I thought maybe they were making a little jab at Superman with that opening scene as well, potentially. But, it wasn't bad. It was great. So had no qualms with it. Also with the introduction of, we'll get to this right now anyway. So Steve Rogers, right? You first get introduced to him as a small little guy who's getting beat up. You're getting themes and ideas introduced from the start when you meet this guy. And so they're very good at establishing this character quickly and getting an idea of who he is and why he's there, right? But I'd love to throw it back to you guys. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
The introduction of Steve?
Yes. What are your thoughts on him as a character, as I introduce him, and then his development from there?
See, this is where, with this movie, I think I struggled a lot with figuring out how I ought to allocate points here and how to evaluate this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've talked a lot about how you can have the perfect character, but you have to present them with the impossible decisions. And it's kind of like the idea that in terms of their arc, there's not truly an arc for their character because their character isn't exactly changing who they are, if that makes sense. Like Steve Rogers throughout this movie, I would argue, doesn't truly change who he is innately. And that's the whole point. And that's the conversation he has with the doctor when he says, good becomes great. So if anything, he just becomes better. But it's like he becomes great in the sense that he is empowered.
Mm-hmm.
But the character of Captain America remains the same. And that's crucial to the story of this movie because if he didn't have that good character, he wouldn't have been chosen for this project.
Correct.
And so it's like, okay, then, and we can get to the impossible decisions later, but then it becomes, well, should this movie be evaluated in the same way that we ought to evaluate other movies? I think is kind of where I'm coming from here. Because Captain America's character is a very unique one in that him being consistent and not having that massive character development is essential to who he is as a character throughout the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously I'm open to pushback here because I'm still trying to sort this out.
Sure. So as a question, do you generally fall on the side of what Avalon was indicating earlier, that you think that this breaks the 9 points?
Well, it depends on how you interpret some of the questions, really.
Yeah, and so I have the 9 points up right here, and so the one where I was having
But like,
trouble.
sorry, let me rephrase the question. Do you think that this movie is better than the rating you gave it?
Yes.
Okay, interesting.
If I were just to gauge this movie, I would probably give it a 7, 6.5 to a 7. And the reason why is because this movie, and I'll get into this later as to why, this movie is a movie that I enjoy watching repeatedly. And if there's a movie that I would enjoy watching pretty much, not like all the time, but any time, I would give it a solid 7. That's not to say that it's the most phenomenal movie, but giving a movie a 7 in my mind is giving a ranking that is deserving of a movie that I am willing to rewatch without any, like, much of an argument. Like if someone says, hey, I'm going to watch this movie, I'm totally down to watch that movie. And I would not say the same for the Thor movies, aside from like the first one. That said, though, the one of the questions that I kind of sat there for like at least 20 minutes thinking about is the main character flawed in a compelling way, or is there something missing from the main character's life which they need to be made whole? And after thinking about it, I think there's a plausible way you could make the question work. And the thing that'd be missing from Steve Rogers' life would be his love interest. But then it just feels weird and mushy, and I don't like that, and it makes me feel icky. It just doesn't feel right for
Well,
Steve
based on the
Rogers'
context
character.
of this movie, yes, that makes sense.
Yes, for this movie specifically, I would say it makes sense. I don't know that it's drawn out as well as it could have been, though.
Right.
And
I mean, like, if you want to say that he doesn't have a woman, like, this becomes a romance movie, and this is really not a romance movie. Like, I think we can all agree. Watching this movie, you're not like, love is the big story here, you know?
yeah,
So
it's obviously not the theme they're going for.
right.
And so I think the thing that's missing from his life, it kind of is, it's filled in pretty early on in the movie when he's given the powers of Captain America. And it's like, it's almost like he's given mini quests, is the best way I can put it throughout the movie. It's like he split it in 3 acts. The first portion of the movie, what he's missing is the ability to contribute. And then he is given the strength to contribute to this cause he wants to be a part of. The second portion of the movie, he lacks the means. He is not put in a position where he can put his talents to good use. And then the third portion of the movie, he is in a position to do so, and he ends up having to sacrifice himself. And so the very last act of this movie is where he's given that impossible decision, so to speak. But for the first two portions of the movie, it's like we have like mini movies almost. I don't know. Like, I'm just thinking out loud here.
Okay, sure. Avalon, I'd love to see. Is this the same area where you feel like you have beef with the film? Or,
Well,
sorry,
I mean,
with the film in relation to the 9 points, which we use to review movies
so
on
I
this
mean, the
podcast.
way I answered this particular question was the main character compellingly flawed? And if I have to answer it literally, the answer would be no, because the character isn't flawed, not really, and he doesn't. And as Andrew said, he doesn't really change from beginning of the movie to the end. So, but at the same time, I think he's a compelling character because he embodies like several human ideals. He embodies like the whole like patriotic fervor of the American spirit in some ways. Whereas like you stand up against oppression and tyranny and you fight for the people around you and you try to like you don't let injustice slide, you don't let bullies have their way, more or less. He's this embodiment of these specific values of freedom and of liberty and some of these ideas that are inherent to like that we associate with America, this like historical American ideals. Anyway, so I just see like in his character, I see things that are compelling and are that you can relate to in a certain level because of the ideals that are present. But I don't see him as a flawed character. So
Sure. And so this is where I do think the movie is flawed. I don't think that it's a problem with the 9 points, and I'm going to explain that right now. I do think that this movie is great, right? Very enjoyable. But I think that Steve Rogers, while he is flawed, he is not super flawed. And so his arc is very minimal. And when you see that in the film, this causes to some of the detriments in the film overall. Now, Steve Rogers' flaw, in my opinion, is that he is an insecure individual who needs to prove himself. And that's said from one of the very first lines in the movie where Bucky is talking to him. He's like, "Why are you doing this? Do you got something to prove?" To him as he goes to enlist for the fifth time or whatever. And he just pushes back. He's like, "I need to do this, and everyone else is doing this." And there's this very like deep set insecurity within Steve Rogers of who he is and what it means to be a man or an American or all these different virtues and values that he holds to. And his arc is one where he becomes confident in establishing himself and his personhood and his meaning in life is fulfilled in stepping into this role as Captain America. And the arc, I would say, is small and not super amazing once you get past his initial combat, right? Now this is jumping a little bit ahead, but to explain my point is at the beginning, right? He's super weak, he's not able to fight, all that stuff, and so he's relatively incapacitated. Then a quarter of the way through the movie, you finally get the super serum injected into him, and now he's super strong. But he's thrown to the side as a centerpiece to sell bonds, and he feels like basically his purpose is not fulfilled in this either, and he's still insecure when you see him drawing pictures of himself as a monkey on a tightrope, right? And as part of a circus, right? He still sees this insecurity coming out in other forms. And then he actually goes and saves Bucky, saves the people, and he more or less establishes himself as his character of Captain America and is fulfilled in that. Because that was his goal, I think from then on out, his arc is pretty much completed until he makes the final sacrifice, right? But everything between that is just him being super buff and awesome and always winning. So I think that is his arc. I think that that's what is completed in this story. And because of that, the movie is fairly compelling up to the point where he saves Bucky and the boys. I'm waiting for pushback.
I have to think about this for a minute. So I think Andrew, if he has thoughts already, he would be better if he said something now. But
I didn't give it much points in this area to begin with, which is why I ended up with a 6. I also don't have very many points in other places, and we'll talk to that when we get to it.
Sure.
But I was thinking a lot about what makes a character compelling, right?
Right.
What and is Captain America as a character a compelling character? And when we ask about flaws, the assumption is that a compelling character requires flaws, right?
So the assumption is that by having something they need to grow through, they have
Hmm.
something to learn, which is about the character arc itself.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that you can't empathize with an individual, right? I think that that's one of the things that you see, for example, in a lot of mentor type roles, is they don't necessarily have a ton of flaws or need a ton of flaws because their goal isn't necessarily to have an arc. Their goal is to help the protagonist in their path to grow in whatever way they need to fulfill the story goal, right? And so you can still look at characters who don't have flaws and find empathy and value and associate positively with them because they have positive attributes, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Um, and then I was also, and well, I'll jump ahead a little bit because this has to do with Steve's progression as a character.
Right.
And when we're talking about heightened tensions, right? You have Bucky's death, which I think is a big missed opportunity in this movie. Um, because, and this goes off of what you're talking about too, because you have the first portion of the movie where Steve kind of wants to do the right thing, but lacks the ability to do so. And he feels the need to prove himself. Who's always there to push him? It's Bucky. Bucky is this person that has always been there for him, who's always been there to support him, and always been there to save him. Then you have him save Bucky in the movie, right? He goes and he does this massive risky maneuver, saves his best friend. Bucky dies on this train. The only scene we get where Steve is kind of feeling remorse is this
Actually,
scene
he
where
dies
he's
falling out of the train, and does he die? I don't know. That scene, I have to say, bothered me because you can be super buff and you're gonna fall that far and you're gonna break every bone in your body and be a ragdoll. But that's a story for the next movie, not for this one.
well, the idea is that
Keep
he was
going.
experimented upon prior to that when he was in that Hydra base.
So basically, he
Um,
already was a super soldier.
or the beginnings of one.
Okay, I'd be willing to buy that. I don't want to get caught up in that.
So, anyways, regardless of whether or not he survives, unlike the Thor movies where Loki comes back at the end, there's no hint that he's back by the end of this movie. He is truly gone in the eyes of the viewers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for the sake of the story, it doesn't make sense to bring him back. It feels
Yeah.
better that he just appear to be dead at least.
Yeah.
So
The problem I have with this is, aside from the one like 2-minute conversation he has with Peggy, there's no real indication that he's grieving in this movie, which is where I think his character suffers. Because even if you are the perfect character, if your best friend dies, you are going to be feeling the emotional weight of that as a person. In Steve Rogers, up until this point, he's been the perfect character, but he hasn't had any like world-shattering loss. And when you have a perfect character, you put them through something like that so that you can give the audience something to empathize with, so you can make them compelling despite the fact that you have all of these things going for them. But when you make it so that he has like a 2-minute conversation and portions of that conversation are just him saying, I can't get drunk, watch me drink a ton of alcohol, it doesn't end well. It doesn't translate very well to the audience to make Steve Rogers' character compelling. At least that was my thought process, and why I think that Bucky's character as a whole in this movie ends up getting kind of wasted, because there's lots of build up, and then the culmination of that build up ends up not terminating in such a way that's compelling for Steve's character.
Interesting. I always assumed that it was showing maybe a slight flaw in the American ideal, in that a lot of Americans have this idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and, being a man who just takes it and doesn't show emotion when tough times come. And that was him trying to do that as best as he could, although he was honestly suffering. So it's interesting. I don't know that I have strong opinions on it either way, other than to say I think that modern Hollywood movies are generally way over the top emotional in regards to what they display on the screen. So it's sometimes refreshing to not have that excess, but I don't know that that's necessarily appropriate in this case. So this is, once again, just me thinking out loud now. Go ahead.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to go Avalon.
I'm not sure where we are in terms of discussion because I was thinking about what Maverick said, and now I feel like we've moved on already. But regarding this particular scene where he said he's grieving, one thing I noticed this time around, which I didn't notice before, is the way Steve Rogers talks about the situation. He's not just grieving. The reality is he's also thinks it's his fault that Bucky died. He's almost like blaming himself for what happened and the way he's talking about the situation. It's almost like he's feels guilty as well as grieving, and he's like refusing to see it any other way. That this was because he was one leading the mission, and because he wasn't able to save Bucky, it's on him what happened to Bucky.
Which I'm not saying there isn't that there, right? I think that they do this in Star Wars Episode 4 too, where you have like Ben Kenobi die and Luke is grieving on the Millennium Falcon for like a minute, and then that's it.
And then he's like, "Yahoo! I'm shooting starships."
Yeah, and we forget about it. Or like when his aunt and uncle are roasted alive, and he looks at them and goes, "Oh wow, that's crazy, bro. Let me go and fly spaceships now." And so it's like they give you that moment, right, where he's grieving. But then after that, there's nothing else. There's no like calling back to that. And I mean, the only way I could see them saying there's some sort of callback to it is like his just sheer determination to fly that ship into the ice. It's him being like, no one else is going to die as a result of me failing. But the problem is you have to read into that. There's no real, I think, tie-in, I guess is the best way I could put it. It just feels very blocky or chunky, I guess, in terms of like how they're trying to present the movie at this point, because they spend so much time in other portions building up to this, and then they just go, okay, he died, he's grieving. Okay, he's at this base now, he's doing an epic fight scene. Okay, he's on the plane now, he fights Red Skull. Okay, now he needs to sacrifice himself and he's going to die here.
Well, I think that's a problem with a bunch of Hollywood movies. That's not just exclusive to this and Star Wars, where it's like you just have this one scene that's supposed to encapsulate months of grieving, instead of just like, oh, they grieve, so like showing, oh, this had an effect on him, and then they move on to something else.
Yeah. So I will also say, I think one of the places that and why I also think this movie, I still would give it more points than the system does, and this is not very many in this regard, is I think they tried very hard to stick to the original story that was Captain America here. So they limited themselves in what they could do here, which there are drawbacks and there are benefits to this, because there are some Marvel movies that have taken incredible creative liberties. Some creative liberties that had no purpose whatsoever. And so I do appreciate them sticking to the script, if you will. I think that also hindered them in their ability to convey certain emotions here. But I think what they probably needed to do was show a shift in Captain America's character post Bucky dying. And what they probably would have needed to do is establish some very definitive characteristics early on, and then showed a very distinctive shift post him dying. Just as a way for us as the audience to subconsciously recognize, okay, something is different about him. This is how he's handling it. Rather than just, oh, I'm drinking by myself in a bar.
Right. You're saying that, like, even though this was a huge emotional loss to Steve Rogers, he doesn't really display it, or it doesn't really have an impact beyond him in that 2-minute scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And generally, when you want a sacrifice to occur, you want it to have a lot of meaning for the story going forward. You know, the classic Gandalf fights the Balrog. Now they've lost their main leader in the Fellowship. How are they going to push forward? And you see conflicts as the Fellowship starts to fall apart from there, right? So that's the type of thing. You don't just want it to be emotional. You want it to have significant impact on how they carry on forward. You don't really get that with Bucky. And also, you just don't really see it in how Steve acts himself.
Well, like, and the best way I can think of this terminating, right? You have Bucky or Captain America being unsure of himself, and what you would do is him post his first initial mission, right? He goes 30 miles behind enemy lines, he saves that group of soldiers, brings them back, starts his own little troop. What you do is you emphasize the fact that he's become emboldened. He begins to feel invincible in a sense. He has his shield, he's destroying Hydra bases, nothing can stop him. There's no casualties, there's no cost for him. After him having to pay the toll of his best friend's life, you show little bits in this, and you could do it in this last mission, where he becomes more reserved, he becomes more hesitant, he's more overly protective of those he cares about. Other than it just being him being on the plane and saying, okay, I'm going to fly this into the Pacific now and just, die.
Right. Do you think that Bucky's death has actual weight in the story and you have a problem with how it's rated in the system? Or are you saying this is actually one of the reasons you wouldn't give it a 9?
This is one of the reasons I wouldn't give it a 9.
Gotcha. Okay. Avalon, what are your thoughts? I don't want to have us hog the mic.
I mean, I'm yeah, I don't know. I'm still thinking about this.
Sure, that's fair.
Yeah.
So all of this is put in light of the background of this character of Red Skull, right? Who's this Schmidt guy, and he's out there to basically take over the world, and be the enemy in everyone's side, including Germany. What are your thoughts on the creation of Red Skull, his interpretation in this film? Was he compelling? Was he not? And either of you feel free to go first.
I mean, I'll only say that Red Skull is supposed to be the antithesis to Captain America. He is intentionally portrayed to be the exact opposite, character-wise, to who Steve Rogers is. Where Steve Rogers is more humble, Red Skull is more arrogant. Where Steve Rogers is like patriotic about his fellow man, Red Skull takes advantage of the people around him and like uses them to his own gains and his own benefits. Steve Rogers is patriotic, whereas Red Skull's just wants to create one world under himself, more or less. So, So like you just have these like opposite ideals. So of course they're going to come into conflict with each other, and the movie sets that up pretty early on. Like this is going to happen, and it happens by the end.
Yeah, and I do think that it was kind of cool to have that idea that Captain America is just this small town dude from Brooklyn, right? This nobody type personality versus you have Schmidt, Red Skull, who's like, I am becoming a god. I am that awesome. We have risen above other men. And you have, even in that idea, some very strong themes and conflicts that come out of that. I agree. Do you think that his conflict with Captain America was effective as a counter?
Well, because for the most part, they're like, for the first half of the movie, they don't even meet. It's almost like from afar, more or less. And you're not even aware that Schmidt is aware of Steve Rogers before that point, because you don't see him reacting to anything Captain America related. I mean, the only thing you know is that he, obviously Dr. Erskine, injected Steve Rogers, made him to a super soldier. So in that regards, Red Skull knows about him through that. But trying to formulate my thoughts here. But I did think after they meet, you start to see their conflict, and you see them how like butting heads, and like Steve Rogers intentionally going after Hydra and causing delays to Red Skull's plans, and it becomes this interesting like you see. And while the only problem with the conflict is it does feel a little one-sided, where Captain America wins most of the time. I mean, it's a montage, so I mean, you're only seeing like all these almost like fights of course of camp, like clearly a section of months. Like it doesn't happen overnight, and the montage does a good job showing, okay, this took place over a long period of time, and we're shown like Red Skull getting frustrated.
All I do is win, no matter what. Anyways, go ahead.
So I mean, So I mean, I almost wish they had shown more like of that conflict. Maybe Red Skull like getting a one up on Captain America to show that he was like he had the ability to stop him more than he actually did. But that's my only real complaint against the conflict as a whole. So, and I did because I do appreciate the conflict of ideals represented in their characters. I really enjoyed that part of the movie,
Yeah.
especially the one scene which I didn't like this time around where he unmasks himself. You start to realize why, like how he's like after meeting Captain America, it's almost like this frustration realizing that Captain America is perfect where he is not. So it's almost like he brazenly like shows himself and decides to make that his new persona going forward instead of hiding it under a mask anymore.
But you see, it's an allegory. You can have fake news, but when it's presented with the truth, it can't stand up, and it is shown to be the falsity that it
Wow,
is.
okay. Okay, now Andrew is back. Okay.
I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself there.
We were waiting for you.
Just like, okay, now we know he's not an alien.
Been?
Now that we're back, though, stop for this quick segment, just so you can hear. Fun fact, Marjorie Tyrell is in this movie, and she makes out with Captain America, and I saw that and went, wow, Captain America, you lucky man.
What?
That is a classic Andrew line right there. Of course.
And Maverick was thinking the same thing, if only he'd known it was Marjorie Tyrell, but he was too blind to recognize that.
I did not recognize that, no.
I want to apologize on behalf of our podcast for the listeners who are listening to this podcast.
Oh, well, we can go to what you're going to say. I was just reminding Avalon we were talking about Red Skull and the confrontation over the bridge where truth met lies.
Yeah, and the conflict over the bridge, from there on out, right, you have Red Skull always losing, and he even screams that in the middle of the film, you're losing, because he's pissed off. And that's kind of the epitome of the hero not having to struggle because they're always winning. And you know that that's important because even the writers of the story knew that that was happening, and you see that in how they shifted a lot of the focus at that point away from the primary conflict down to secondary conflicts or B plots, where they start focusing a lot on the Peggy Carter conflict, where is she in love with Captain America or is she not? Is he, going to get the girl or is he not? And that becomes a major point in this part of the movie because the main conflict became a lot less compelling now that the hero is always winning. So,
Peggy Carter's character is she's interesting. I don't think she functions very well as a main character because we're talking about the subplot that follows after the conflict. She becomes a conflict.
I lost the connection. Like, why are we talking about Peggy Carter all of a sudden?
He thought Red Skull is done. Is Red Skull done? You could talk about Peggy Carter if Red Skull's done.
I mean, I don't really have any major issues with Red Skull. Most of what I would talk about with Red Skull goes back to what I want to talk about with Captain America, but I don't know if we want to go back to that.
Sure. I mean, yeah, we can move on. I just wanted to make sure everything was covered. In my mind, part of the problem with him is that he actually doesn't, he loses a lot to Captain America. And so it makes him much less of a threat appearing to the audience if the hero's always winning and he's not able to fight him effectively. So
I just don't ever see him as a threat, really. Like,
right?
He's more of a threat to Germany than he is to Captain America.
True. Yeah. I mean,
Berlin is on this map, so it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like he literally, as soon as he sees Captain America on one of his cameras, he packs up his bags and leaves. He's like, oh, this guy's too strong for me. Time to deuce out, my guys. See ya.
I kind of wanted to see an epic fist fight between them. I will say, thinking about Captain America more, right? Because I think this movie presents a very interesting dilemma, okay? And that is that, and this is why, this is going to go back to Captain America Brave New World. This is one of the reasons why I don't think you can have another Captain America, okay? Because what the MCU is trying to do now is say that Captain America is a symbol, right? It is an idea. It is this American idea. But apparently it's not even just an American idea anymore. It's just being good and right. But when you think about who is Captain America, it's Steve Rogers. Steve Rogers and Captain America are synonymous, and they are made to be so throughout these movies. And I think that's what makes his character compelling in some way, even though I don't think he's as compelling in this movie as he is in other movies. I think that the ideals he stands for are very much a symptom of the time that he grew up in, right? The time he's living in is World War II, right?
Mm-hmm.
We are full gung ho patriotism, kill the Nazis, okay? The worst thing that could ever happen to the planet. We have to wipe them off the face of the earth, all right?
Mm-hmm.
And they even have lines like, who wants to go kill some Nazis, right? It's just, they're bad, no questions asked.
Right.
It's like the evil empire. And so he stands for very American values, individualism, freedom, standing up for the little guy. He says, I don't like bullies. That's why I'm here to fight, right? He looks at the Nazis as the ultimate bully,
Mm-hmm.
which in a very real sense of the term they are, because, you get things like the Holocaust, which isn't even touched on in this movie.
Right.
And so when you take away those, when you try to separate those elements, right, Captain America and Steve Rogers, what you're doing is you're saying the symbol that is Captain America, you're trying to put the character of Steve Rogers on Sam Wilson, because it isn't just the shield or this idea of being good. Who Captain America is very much all of the same character traits of who Steve Rogers was. But you have this character of Sam Wilson who's been built up as his own individual, and now you're saying, okay, put on the mantle of not just Captain America, put on the mantle of Steve Rogers. And so I don't think it functions. That said, though, I think that's one of the things that makes him compelling, and also one of the reasons that he's interesting is that he is not just this good character. Captain America is very much meant to be an embodiment of American values, in superhero form.
I mean, I already explained my thoughts on him as a character. I do think that he has compelling virtues and values. It makes him likable as a character. Like I said, I think he has flaws, right? I think that those terminate earlier on in the film and resurface briefly at the end when he goes, I'm going to drive this ship into the snow, right?
Mhm.
I think that overall, I think that the score I got was actually relatively accurate, both to how I perceive the movie should be rated, and also I think actually how I analyzed it fulfills what Andrew would expect of the movie and give it the rating that he thinks that it deserves. So, I don't have a problem with how things turned out. I think that he's a solid character. He's got great things going for him, and he's likable. And in this movie, he has a somewhat interesting arc, and it relates also to the B arc as well with Peggy Carter as she is the romance plot.
Well, I think, yeah, also, just despite all of the problems that I've listed and we've listed thus far, I think this is still an example of a character who is morally upright and always tries to make the right decision, done in a compelling way. And like
Right.
we've talked about other characters that do this in a bad way, like Rey or Mufasa. These characters who are always doing the right thing but are in no way compelling to the audience.
Right.
Captain America is a compelling character because his choices make sense for his background, right? You have characters like Mufasa. Why do you always want to do the right thing? Or Rey, what makes you always want to choose to do what's right? Whereas with Captain America, it's very obvious, because this is what America stands for. This is what it means to be patriotic. I was bullied as a kid. I don't want other people to suffer the same way that I did. Therefore, I stand up to bullies. And at the same time, I could do this all day, okay? Like he has the resilience of the American spirit. All of this is embodied within him, which is why, even though he's always making these decisions to do the right thing, which for the most part isn't typically compelling, it's compelling with his character because there are very clear motivations as to why he wants to make those decisions.
Right. Right.
So
Cool.
I've listed my qualms. I still gave it a 6, which is pretty high praise for all the other Marvel movies we've ranked on here. So
Right. And honestly, like you said, you would probably give it closer to a 7, which isn't that far off even from where you were at with how you stabbed it. Avalon, what are your thoughts? Do you have any closing thoughts on him before we move on to the side characters?
I mean, I've been trying to think about what you said, and I think I don't think you're wrong. I think you're actually now I'm thinking about it, I think you might be at least partly right, because there's some evidence of that in the story. Um, I'm just like, the thing I'm trying to wrestle with is all the hatred and like opposition he receives before that, is that just because he's trying to prove something, or is it just because of his position in life, where it's like because he's like trying to do what's right and he gets oppressed, because I also think there's another facet to a compelling character where it's like, it's not just are they flawed, also the fact of the matter is, are they the underdog kind of situation, where it's like, this is a character who starts from the ground up, and you definitely see that with Captain America Steve Rogers in this story. So the question I have in my mind is the opposition he receives in this movie because he's trying to prove something, or is it because he's like, is this the underdog that I was seeing before, or is this because of his own problems, I guess?
Oh, yeah. So you're saying that there's something about the oppression from external forces that can make someone a compelling character, even though they don't have
In some
anything
ways, yes.
inwardly to prove. I mean, like I said before, the whole point of the question of is a character flawed goes back to having a starting point to grow from in regards to a character arc. So that's the focus of it, not necessarily is the conflict compelling. Can you have someone grow through a conflict that they are already rightly aligned value wise and character wise if they have a big force against them?
I'm sorry, was that a question, or was that just a long
Yeah, yeah.
thought?
I mean, like it started off as a monologue and then turned into a question, so I guess that's kind of a fair critique. I mean, I think the reason that the question is worded the way it is because it's all about, does the character learn? Do they grow? Do they become a better person having gone through this, right? And if they don't, right, if they don't have any basis of problems to start from, I think it's harder at the very least to prove a place to grow to, right, and to learn and to become a better person. You can have amazing conflict between two characters, but if the conflict is, I'm a perfect god and you're a perfect villain and we fight it out, there's only so much that goes through before you go, okay, I've seen this fight a million times. So I haven't personally found.
Well, I actually wasn't. Okay, good.
No, well, all I was gonna say is I haven't personally found a reasonable way to have a character that grows without having them have a place of weakness that they start from.
So I guess, just to clarify, I'm not against what you're saying as far as him like being insecure, like trying to prove himself.
Yeah.
It just reframes some of the earlier parts of the movie then, because it makes me wonder, like, well, okay, then does that mean Steve Rogers is his own worst enemy then, whereas like he's bringing this conflict and opposition against him, like the bullies kind of thing, because he's trying to prove himself? Or is this like just because he is small and is like trying to stand up for what's right and he just gets persecuted kind of thing? That's what I'm trying to think through. Just like the dichotomy, is it one or the other?
I mean, you could say that the outward conflict is validation for the inward struggle, but also like all personal change happens on the inside, right? Regardless of what conflict is going on the outside. The outside should manifest that in some way in the film, in the story, but like there's plenty of films that are very much external conflict that also deal with someone growing and becoming a better person as they learn something, right? And so, I mean, heck, Andrew's favorite movie, Star Wars Episode 3, is a full manifestation of that. So, anyways, but that's all there is to say on that. If we're good with Steve Rogers, I feel like we've really spent a lot of time on him on this episode, so I want to move on unless you have anything else you wanted to add, Avalon.
I mean, I think we could probably keep talking about Steve Rogers because I think there's more to be mined there. But I think you're right. For the sake of this podcast, it would. I think if they were going to talk more about Steve Rogers, it almost has to be like a movies worth watching kind of thing, or we bring up a character study kind of thing.
Sure, and we also have two more Captain America movies to review, and those things could come out then as well. So we'll get into that more on future episodes, but for now we're going to let that lie. We're going to go to Peggy Carter and the Colonel. What are you guys' thoughts on these two cahooties?
Well, what I said about this, I did mention in my review that because this is a war story, where everyone is kind of on the same side fighting for the end of the war, it's really hard to screw that up with side characters because in reality, most everyone in a story like this, they're just wanting to get to the end of the war. They're trying to achieve victory. So it makes sense for all these characters to be like invested in the war in some capacity without being fully developed into their like, oh, why are you invested in the war kind of thing? Because everyone is doing it, and this is a wartime thing where it's like,
right.
I mean, you could. It's like almost written on its face. It was like you could see why people are invested in this. So you don't really need to give a whole lot of nuance to motive per se. Though with that being said, I do think Colonel Phillips and Peggy Carter, like they do have some nuance to their characters in throughout the movie, where it's like they have like their own like reasons for why they seek the end of the war, kind of. Well, not that it's explicitly stated, but it's like you see them like their own reasons for like doing what they're doing.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, there's a little bit of nuance to their motives beyond just their pure patriotism. So I 100% agree. Andrew, do you have any additional thoughts?
I will say, I really do appreciate Peggy's character for not being the type of feminine lead who's like, I'm a woman in a man's field, and that being her entire character. Like, yeah, she is a woman in a male dominant field, you know, considering it's the US military during World War II.
Right.
But she isn't getting caught up in the fact that I'm a woman and I'm going to show you all. Like, there are definitely other elements to her character, right? She also isn't dead set upon making her character as masculine as possible. Like, she definitely embraces her feminine side. Like, you see that when she goes up to the bar in that bright red dress and she's talking to Steve, right?
Right.
And so I think she is a female lead in a male dominated workplace done well. I'm not sure if that came across right, but there's an idea I'm trying to convey there.
Sure. Well, I mean, you have, for example, Captain Marvel, who's like the I am a strong woman, everyone check this out, versus Peggy Carter, who's a earlier representation of a woman in a military situation who doesn't do that. She's clearly very competent, as you see how she punches a guy in the face from the start and says, nah, you're not going to do that to me. You're not going to talk to me that way. But then she also moves on and has other attributes that far outshine that because it's not getting caught up in whether or not she's oppressed as a woman in this field when she's clearly competent in the field. There's a much more important fish to fry in this case.
And I think...
So,
yeah. Go ahead.
No, that was most of it.
I think what it does is a couple of things. One, it's like the idea that if you have to tell someone that you're something, it means you probably aren't. And so if you're a character who's constantly trying to tell us that you are competent and you can do this job, then you probably can't, which is why I think Captain Marvel has problems. Whereas Peggy Carter, she doesn't feel the need to tell and justify herself to all these men. She punches them in the face and says, I can do this. Or she will just do it. But secondly, I think it does more justice to women in this movie too. Like, this is just an empowered female role, okay? And she doesn't feel the need to compete with these men. She's comfortable in her position, and she knows she could take some of these guys. She outranks them. And even if she isn't as strong as all of them, she's just as competent.
Right. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I mean, you guys have said everything I have to say about this character, so I'm not going to add anything because that was perfect. And I align fully on those thoughts. What are you guys' thoughts on the ending of the film? Do you think that it was a compelling ending? He wakes up from the ice after throwing his life to what was it, the North Pole or wherever he was. Was it compelling? Did you look at this and be like, wow, what a movie. I want to watch this again.
From my understanding, Avalon would probably know this better, because as much as I love Star Wars, I'm not as in tune with Marvel comics, at least not Captain America. But from my understanding in the comics, the Avengers find Captain America. It's not just Nick Fury who finds him, right?
Well, yeah, in the original comics, it was the Avengers, but I mean, the movies, in a way, were trying to streamline that process. And,
Yeah,
like,
they're trying to just have all the Avengers unite at the same time, which makes sense thematically. I thought the ending was good. I think we see like the most human element of Captain America post his like saving his best friend in this scene. When he gets out, he has this reaction to this, like what's going on. And also, when you think about the fact that he comes from a time of Nazis and being put into concentration camps, and he wakes up and he's like, I'm clearly being tricked right now. And he breaks out, and then his first reaction to Nick Fury is, I missed my date. Crap. Honestly, I'd say the same thing.
Well, I want to go back a little bit before that, just because what I appreciate about the beginning of this movie, and one thing we didn't cover about the very beginning of this movie, is it's also a form of foreshadowing, telling us what's going to happen in this movie. Because obviously, like, with the beginning of the scene of the frozen north, where they find this ship and the shield in the ice, we don't see more than that. But obviously, we know this movie has to lead to that point. And so in the audience's mind, they have to know, like, subconsciously that, okay, the movie is going to somehow get to this point. We just don't know when or how. So when we see Captain America going towards the ice, at that point, their subconscious will start filling in the blanks, and you begin to realize where this is going. And it almost seems inevitable. And it almost gives a sense of like foreboding in that moment, where you realize, oh, this is where the story is going. And it adds a whole lot of emotional depth to that scene, because now you realize how the scene is going to end, and it's not good.
Right.
And also, another thing about the conversation at the end between Peggy and Captain America is such a good conversation, because it's like, they're talking about, like, this isn't going to happen. Both of them know this isn't going to happen, but they're having this fake conversation about going to a dance soon, because it's like, they both know what's about to happen. And and Captain America's like, I have to do this if I'm going to save lives. If I'm going to pull the ship down.
Yeah. With all that American writing on the side, all in English. How convenient of you, Germans. Very nice, very clever of you. No,
do not question my genius.
Hydra needed the United States to see them coming, okay?
Right, exactly. Yo, we know where this ship is flying to. Crap.
I love the fact that each of the nukes is labeled with the country it's going to hit.
And then it's like autopilot is written in English for the German pilot.
I'm just imagining the Hydra workers going, this one is going to Russia, this one is going to China. Hello, Kim Jong-un.
Oh my god.
Except he's not alive yet.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, obviously that's a small beef, but that was purely for our purposes to understand, to tell us what was going to happen without having a little monologue of, oh my goodness, is that German for New York? Like, that doesn't, we didn't need that, but it is a little weird. Anyways, I completely derailed myself on that thought. No, okay, so the only thing going back to the beginning that I thought was appropriate about that ending, it's the beginning of the movie, the only thing you see is the shield. You don't see Captain America. You don't know if he's alive or not, right? And so when you have that foreboding and you start to realize where the pieces are being put together and what's about to happen, you still don't actually know if Steve Rogers is going to survive this. And so the idea is very much that there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding this situation. Versus other movies, cue The Dead Don't Hurt, which we reviewed a couple months ago. We've been really good with talking about all the different ways that we've already talked about these things and how they come together in this film. So, good job, guys. But that's an example where you reveal something at the beginning and then flashback, and it is just not good because you revealed way too much. So, anyways, what are your guys' thoughts on the lasting impact of this film?
Well, I do want to say one more thing about the ending. Sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
So, I mean, obviously we don't know in the opening scene whether Captain America is actually dead or not. And I mean, it's logical to assume he's dead. Though we also had the scene earlier in the movie where he's talking about how his body processes things faster and is able to survive a lot more and has regenerative properties. So when it's revealed that he's actually been asleep for 70 years in the ice, in some ways it's like not completely unexpected because it kind of slightly follows through off of things we heard already. But it also kind of creates a secondary like moment of despair where it's like Steve Rogers just lost everything.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like he's now in a completely new world. Everyone he loved and knew is gone, pretty much, as far as we know. The world, everything that he held on to previously is no longer existent, or exists in a new form, or whatever. So it's like, in a certain way, it adds a whole lot of meaning and loss to his character in that scene. What he's just gone through.
Yeah,
I just felt like it was necessary to point that out. Like,
yeah, no,
for the
that's
sake of
true.
the story.
It's not completely a, oh my goodness, thank goodness he's safe. You could still sympathize with where he finds himself when he wakes up. So that's no joke. They do it well. Like we said, this is not a terrible movie. It's got a pretty solid score from all of us. It's just you know, they could have done a couple things better. What would you guys change your rating after this review? And more importantly, what do you think about the lasting impact of this film? Andrew, go ahead. You've been a little quiet recently. What's going on?
I'd probably just move it up to like a 6.8. Lasting impact. I think as far as the movies go, this was a solid start to one of the best heroes we have in the MCU. And the thing is Captain America isn't even necessarily my favorite Marvel superhero. But the way that he is executed in these MCU makes him one of my favorite Marvel Cinematic Universe characters.
Nice.
And so like in concept, right? I still like the character of Thor better. The execution of Thor in the Marvel movies, though, I think is done worse than Captain America. Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree with
and
that.
so I think it is done in such a way that they really draw out the American themes, and they really emphasize them in his character, and they're not afraid to do so, right? And you get that in later movies like the Avengers movie, where he is very traditional in the character that he is. He brings up his religious background, the patriotic background that he has fighting in World War II, right? The way that he talks. It sets up and it's consistent throughout the movies. And I think that this movie does a really good job of setting up who Captain America is going into the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah, 100%.
I mean, I think I'd raise my score. I mean, I was at 6.4, so now it's probably going to be at like 7.1 at least. 7.2. I mean, as I said at the beginning of this review process, I would have given it more points on certain things depending on how you interpreted the question.
Right.
And so, like, I wanted to give it more. I just decided to be literal with some of the questions. It's like, oh, well, based on this question, this is how I have to review it. But this is not how I personally believe. Like, I'd give it a higher score, generally, on this point. But yeah, we kind of hashed that out a little bit, and so I think that's clear. Lasting impact, this is one of my, as I kind of agree with Andrew, this is one of the better like portrayed heroes in the MCU. Like all three of his movies are pretty well done. The first three Captain America movies are excellent superhero movies, and I enjoy watching almost all three of them whenever they show up. So
nice.
And I don't think there's any other MCU trilogy I can say that about. Like any of the other there's like maybe like Iron Man or like a few other like first ones. I can say, oh, I like that one, or I like this one, but I can't really say, oh, I like all the Iron Man movies. I like all the Thor movies. So it's like
you don't like all the Guardians movies? What the heck, Am? You don't like all the Ant-Man movies? Oh my goodness!
You didn't have any of the Guardians of the Galaxy podcast reviews.
True.
So
where are you at, Nicholas? True. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm leaving you mine where it is. I do think that this movie has a lot to say about the series, so I have nothing else to add on that either. So I'm not going to waste your guys' time. You guys should go back to the archives and listen to the other episodes because we have so many more to talk about, and we reference so many things that you didn't catch at all. You have to go back and listen to it. So here
And
we
tune
are.
in next time for the best Captain America movie ever.
Yeah, we just skipped straight to Civil War.
What? No.
Oh, I was gonna reference the old Captain America movie from like the 1990s, but okay.
That'd be amazing.
I was so close to putting my middle finger on the screen.
And that's the pod. We hope you all enjoyed. We will be back as we always are next week. We'll see you all